It was supposed to be a simple trip, just a few days to escape the noise, the stress of everyday life. We weren't looking for anything extraordinary, just a break. The kind where you pitch a tent, gather around a fire, and let the crackling flames and steady beat of rain lull you into a sense of peace. But sometimes the quiet has a way of deceiving you. Before I go deeper into the story, welcome, and make sure to subscribe to the channel, Echoes of Nightmares, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on any of the future scary tales. If you're enjoying this story, hit that like button too. Now back to my story. It started with small things that seemed almost unnoticeable at first. A twig snapping in the distance, shadows shifting in the corner of my eye. We told ourselves it was just the forest playing tricks, the mind filling in the gaps with harmless explanations. But there are moments when the woods seem to breathe, when the space between the trees feels closer than it should. And it was in one of those moments that everything changed. Stay with me, because this isn't just a story about what happened out there in the rain. The real horror, the thing that keeps me awake at night, didn't stay behind in those woods. It followed me, and it's still here. We didn't plan for the rain. The forecast had promised clear skies, maybe a breeze or two, but no mention of the storm that would soon chase us deep into that forest. There were 4 of us, close friends since childhood. We had camped together dozens of times, always craving the quiet that came with stepping away from the world. This trip was supposed to be just like the others, a weekend escape, nothing more. The drive took longer than expected, winding down narrow roads that snaked through small, forgotten towns. As we pushed deeper into the countryside, the trees grew taller, their branches reaching out over the road like arms ready to close in around us. I remember the air felt thicker, heavier, as if even the land itself didn't want us there. By the time we arrived at the trailhead, the rain had already started. Not enough to cause concern, just a gentle patter that felt almost soothing. The kind of rain that makes you want to sit by a window with a book. We thought nothing of it. We loaded up our gear, double-checked the trail map, and set off into the forest. It was peaceful at first. The rain, barely more than a mist, seemed to muffle the world around us. Our laughter bounced between the trees, and for a while, everything felt normal. But as we trekked deeper into the woods, the rain grew heavier, and the landscape around us began to change. The trees were denser here, their trunks wide and gnarled, covered in moss so thick it looked like they were breathing. The path, once clear and well-trodden, became narrow, overgrown, almost as if it hadn't been used in years. It felt like the forest was closing in on us, the canopy overhead becoming a roof that blocked out the daylight, leaving everything in a dim, gray light. And then there was the silence. It hit me first. I noticed it after we had been walking for a while, deeper into the forest than we had planned. The birds had stopped singing. The wind, which had been rustling through the leaves, had stilled. Even the sound of the rain seemed muted, like it was falling through thick air. There was just nothing, an absence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced at my friends, wondering if they felt it too, but no one said anything. We kept moving, though our pace had slowed. That feeling, the one I couldn't shake, the feeling that we weren't alone, was growing stronger with every step. It's strange how the forest can play tricks on you. Shapes start to shift. The shadows between the trees seemed to stretch and move. It felt as if we were being watched. Not in the way you feel when you pass a deer in the woods and it freezes, staring at you with wide eyes, waiting to run. This was different. It was more like the forest itself was watching us, as if the trees had eyes, as if the earth beneath us was waiting for something. We reached the clearing just as the rain turned from a drizzle to a downpour. It was the kind of heavy rain that soaks you to the bone within seconds, where the drops feel cold and sharp against your skin. We hurried to set up camp, the four of us working in silence, our earlier chatter forgotten. The clearing was small, just big enough for 2 tents, with a large, ancient oak tree standing at its center. The ground was uneven, roots and rocks jutting out in odd places, making it hard to find a flat spot for the tents. But we managed. As the tents went up, I couldn't help but notice how the oak tree loomed over us, its branches twisting in unnatural directions, as if it had been shaped by something other than nature. Its bark was blackened, charred in places, though there was no sign of fire. The rain pounded against the tents as we sat inside, each of us lost in our own thoughts. There was an unspoken tension in the air. It wasn't just the storm or the isolation. It was something else, something I couldn't name, but I could feel. The air had grown colder, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, making it hard to stay warm even inside the tent. And still, the silence persisted. No birds, no animals, no wind. Just the relentless drumming of the rain and that ever-present feeling that we were being watched. We tried to shake it off, telling ourselves it was just the storm, just our imaginations running wild in the unfamiliar landscape. But deep down, I think we all knew that something was off. We had camped in remote places before, but this was different. I lay there that first night, staring at the roof of the tent, listening to the rain. Every now and then, a branch would snap outside, or I'd hear the faint sound of footsteps in the mud, just far enough away that I couldn't be sure they were real. I told myself it was just the forest, that the rain was distorting the sounds, that everything was fine. But the truth was I didn't believe it. And as I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had wandered into a place we weren't meant to be. There's something about the silence in a forest like that. It's not the quiet you get in a city, where you can still hear the hum of traffic in the distance, or the buzz of electricity in the air. This was a different kind of silence. It pressed in on you, filled the space around you, as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting. And that night, as the rain fell harder, the silence grew even louder. Sleep didn't come easily that first night. I don't think any of us really settled in. Not with the rain pounding against the tents and the wind that seemed to carry strange, unplaceable sounds. Lying there, I kept thinking I heard something beyond the storm. Soft, distant voices, almost like they were trying to rise above the rain. I told myself it was the wind, the way it whipped through the branches, but it didn't feel right. It wasn't just noise. It felt purposeful, like someone or something was out there trying to get our attention. But the rain was so heavy, so constant, it was hard to tell if I was really hearing anything at all. I could feel the weight of exhaustion pulling me under, but every time I started to drift off, there would be a sound, something sharp like the snap of a branch, or a low murmur just outside the tent. My body would jolt awake, senses on high alert, heart racing. I would strain to hear it again, holding my breath, waiting for it. But there was nothing, just the rain. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I remember is waking up suddenly in the middle of the night. The rain had grown even heavier, hammering down with such force that it was like being under a waterfall. It was pitch black inside the tent, the only light coming from the occasional flash of distant lightning. And then I heard it again. This time, the voices were closer. I wasn't dreaming. I know that now. The sound was faint, almost drowned out by the storm, but it was there. I could hear it. Whispers, overlapping, like a conversation happening, just out of reach. But it wasn't just the voices that froze me in place. It was something else, something moving just beyond the thin fabric of the tent. I didn't dare move, didn't dare even breathe. For a moment, everything was still, and I convinced myself it was just the wind, just the rain playing tricks on my mind. But then I saw it, a shadow, a figure moving outside, barely visible in the flashes of lightning. It passed by quickly, just a dark shape against the gray, and then it was gone. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to call out to the others, to see if anyone else had seen it, but the fear lodged itself in my throat, kept me silent. I lay there, wide-eyed, staring at the tent walls, waiting for it to come back. I don't know how long I stayed like that, just listening to the storm, waiting. Minutes? Hours? Eventually, the exhaustion must have caught up to me, because the next thing I remember is waking up to the dull gray light of morning creeping through the tent. The rain had eased, though it hadn't stopped. The air was damp, cold, and the forest was shrouded in mist, making everything look more surreal. We crawled out of our tents, bleary-eyed, and began to talk about the night before. I hadn't been the only one who had trouble sleeping. Greg, one of the more practical ones in the group, said he'd heard the voices too, though he tried to play it off as nothing. It was just the storm, he said, trying to reassure us, but I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't convinced. Then came Alex. He had barely spoken since we woke up, which was unusual for him. He kept pacing around the campsite, rubbing his hands together nervously, glancing at the tree line every few seconds. Finally, he spoke up, voice low and hesitant. Did anyone else see someone out there? Like in the woods? I thought I saw something last night, right outside the tent. He trailed off, looking uneasy, waiting for one of us to back him up. I felt a chill run down my spine. I hadn't told anyone about the figure I'd seen, but hearing Alex say it out loud confirmed my worst fears. There had been something or someone out there. But why? And how had they gotten so close without us hearing more than whispers? The others brushed it off, said it was just the storm messing with our heads. But Alex and I, we knew better. There was something else in those woods. We spent the morning trying to shake off the unease. Breakfast was quick and quiet, the usual banter missing. The rain, now lighter but steady, set a dreary tone, and none of us felt like exploring too far. So we decided to stick close to the campsite, to gather firewood and get the lay of the land. That's when Greg found it. He had wandered off just a bit, looking for dry kindling under the thick brush, when he called out to us. His voice echoed strangely in the mist, and when we found him, he was standing at the base of the old oak tree, staring at something in the mud. It was a book, an old, weathered journal, its cover cracked and worn, like it had been out here for years. The pages were soaked through from the rain, but the writing was still legible. The first few entries were nothing special, just notes about the weather, the forest, basic camping observations. But then, deeper into the journal, the tone changed. The entries became frantic, scrawled messes of handwriting, warning of strange occurrences in the woods. They spoke of voices in the rain, shadows that moved just beyond sight, and a figure, a dark figure that seemed to follow them, always staying just out of reach. There were warnings about the storm, about how the forest wasn't safe when the rain came. The final entry was brief, just a few shaky lines. It watches us. We're leaving tomorrow, but I'm not sure we'll make it out. If anyone finds this, be careful. The storm is a cover for something else. Greg laughed it off, said it was probably just someone playing a prank, but the rest of us weren't so sure. The journal was old, the ink faded in places, and it didn't seem like the kind of thing you just leave behind as a joke. Besides, how long had it been out here? And why hadn't it rotted away? The rain continued to fall, the wind picking up once again, carrying with it the distant sound of voices we could no longer explain away. We packed up the journal, stuffed it into one of our backpacks, and tried to go about the rest of the day like nothing was wrong. But we all felt it. The forest had changed. It was like the trees were closing in, the air growing heavier, thicker with something we couldn't name. We told ourselves we were imagining things, but deep down, we knew the truth. The journal wasn't a joke. It was a warning, and we had ignored it. We should have left then. We should have packed up our tents, turned back, and left that forest behind. But we didn't. We stayed, and that was our mistake. We spent the rest of the morning in silence, each of us lost in our thoughts. The journal had rattled us more than we cared to admit, but none of us were ready to say it out loud. Instead, we just kept going through the motions, gathering firewood, organizing the campsite, anything to keep ourselves busy. But the forest had changed. There was an unease now, a weight in the air that pressed down on us. Even the rain felt different, colder somehow, as if the storm had become more than just a natural force. It was like it was watching us too, waiting for something. It wasn't until we sat down to take a break that we noticed it. At first, it seemed like nothing, a glance, a double take. Greg was the first to point it out, his voice tight with disbelief. Did anyone walk around the tents last night? We all looked over, confused, until we saw what he was pointing at. There, in the mud around the tents, were footprints. They were unmistakable, deep impressions in the wet ground, circling the camp in uneven loops. But none of us had left the tents during the night, not with the storm raging outside. And even if someone had, the prints didn't make sense. They were too far apart, as if whoever made them had taken long, deliberate strides. But more than that, the shape of the footprints was wrong. They weren't like anything I'd ever seen before. Not human, but not animal either. Just wrong. A shiver ran down my spine as we all stared at the prints, unsure of what to make of them. Greg, always the skeptic, tried to laugh it off, saying it must have been a trick of the mud, that the rain had warped them somehow. But none of us were convinced. We knew what we were seeing, even if we didn't want to admit it. Someone or something had been walking around our camp while we slept. And then there were the voices. They'd been faint the night before, barely audible over the storm. But now, in the daylight, with the rain still falling, they were louder, clearer, and they were closer. It wasn't just the wind. It couldn't be. The whispers seemed to come from all around us, weaving through the trees, circling us the way the footprints had. I strained to make out the words, but they were just on the edge of hearing, like fragments of a conversation happening somewhere just out of reach. But they weren't friendly. They were sharp, hissing like something angry or desperate was trying to get our attention. Alex was the first to crack. He stood up abruptly, his eyes wild, scanning the tree line as if he could catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. "We need to leave," he said, his voice tight with fear. "We need to go now." But we didn't. We should have, but we didn't. Greg, always the rational one, insisted we were overreacting. He said the footprints could be explained away, that the voices were just a trick of the wind, that the journal was probably an elaborate hoax left behind by some local kids. And as much as I wanted to believe him, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was wrong. The journal kept pulling in my mind. The entries, cryptic and unsettling, seemed to make more sense now. Whoever had written it had known about the footprints, the voices. They had heard them too, and they had warned about something lurking in the forest, something that came with the rain. The next few entries were more fragmented, harder to follow. The handwriting grew more erratic, the words almost scrawled. They spoke of the watcher in the storm, a figure that moved through the trees, always just out of sight. The writer described seeing it, catching glimpses of it in the distance, but every time they looked, it was gone. But they knew it was there. They felt it. And the rain, it was always there when the rain came. I felt my stomach twist as I read those words, because I realized something. The rain, it hadn't stopped. Not once since we'd arrived. It had started as a drizzle, and now, hours later, it still fell steadily, like a constant presence, drumming against the leaves, against the tents, against the earth. As the day wore on, the tension between us grew. No one wanted to admit it, but we were all on edge, jumpy, every little sound making us flinch. The forest was too quiet. Even the rain seemed to drown out everything else, making the silence between the whispers even more deafening. We tried to stay close to the camp, but as the afternoon wore on, the whispers grew louder. They started to come in waves, like a chant, a rhythmic, almost hypnotic sound that seemed to pulse with the rain. And then we heard something else, footsteps. At first, they were distant, barely audible over the storm. But soon, they grew louder, closer. They were unmistakable now. Heavy, deliberate steps, crunching through the wet underbrush, coming toward us. Alex panicked. He grabbed a flashlight and ran toward the sound, yelling out into the trees. We shouted for him to stop, to stay with the group, but he didn't listen. He was already gone, disappearing into the mist that hung thick between the trees. We waited for him to come back, standing there in the rain, calling his name, but all we heard was the rain and the whispers. Minutes passed, then an hour. Still no sign of Alex. We debated what to do, panic starting to set in. Greg insisted Alex had just gotten turned around, that he'd be back any moment, but the rest of us weren't so sure. The footprints, the voices, the journal, it was all adding up to something far worse than we were ready to admit. Just as the sun began to set, we heard a scream. It was distant, muffled by the storm, but unmistakable. It was Alex. Somewhere out there, in the woods, Alex was screaming. But it wasn't a scream of fear. It was pain. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Cut off like someone had silenced it. We stood frozen, hearts pounding in our chests, the weight of the silence pressing in on us. We called out again, our voices breaking, but there was no response. Just the rain. I felt a sinking dread in my stomach. We should have gone after him, but none of us could move. We were too scared, too aware that whatever had happened to Alex, it was already too late. Night fell quickly after that. The rain grew heavier, the wind stronger, and the whispers, they were louder now, insistent. No longer just background noise, but something tangible, something that felt like it was coming for us. Greg tried to keep us calm, but his voice trembled. Even he couldn't explain what was happening anymore. We huddled close to the fire, though its warmth did nothing to chase away the cold that had seeped into our bones. The forest felt alive around us, shifting and watching, as if we had become prey, waiting for the inevitable. Every sound made us flinch, every shadow made us jump. We tried to stay awake, but the exhaustion was too much. One by one, we drifted off into uneasy sleep, the rain lulling us into a false sense of security. And that's when the real nightmare began. We had no idea what was waiting for us in the dark, but we were about to find out. We barely slept that night. Each of us was haunted by the echoes of Alex's scream. It lingered in our minds, filling the silence that the storm left behind. The fire sputtered under the assault of the rain, and the whispers, those whispers were everywhere. They weren't coming from one direction anymore. They surrounded us, pushing in on us, wrapping us in their strange, rhythmic chant. By morning, we were all in agreement. We had to find Alex. But something was wrong. As we prepared to search the forest, we noticed Greg was quieter than usual. Normally the leader, the rational one. He sat off to the side, staring at the muddy ground where those strange footprints still circled our camp. "Something's not right here," he muttered, almost to himself. He didn't have to tell us. We already knew. The rain hadn't let up. If anything, it had only gotten worse. It was a wall of water now, drenching everything, making it nearly impossible to see beyond a few feet in front of us. But there was no other choice. We couldn't just sit there. We had to find Alex. As we gathered our gear, Greg insisted on keeping the journal with him, reading it over again and again, as if looking for some clue, some explanation. The words inside were warped from the water, but they seemed clearer now, as if the writer had known exactly what was coming for us. "The Watcher comes in the storm," Greg whispered, reading one of the last entries. "It waits in the rain, stalking those who don't heed the warnings." We set out into the woods, trudging through the mud, the storm battering us from all sides. It was slow going. The rain was so heavy, it was like walking through a curtain of water, the ground slick and treacherous underfoot. Every shadow, every flicker of movement in the corner of our eyes set us on edge. We called for Alex, shouting his name over and over, but the wind swallowed our voices, turning them into more whispers that melded with the eerie chant in the trees. Then, after what felt like hours of wandering, we found something. A clearing. It wasn't what we expected. The ground here was different, flattened, as though it had been disturbed recently. And there, in the middle of the clearing, were remnants of old tents, torn and decayed, nearly buried in the mud. They looked as if they'd been abandoned for years. Scattered around were remnants of personal belongings, backpacks, old cans of food, broken lanterns. But there was no sign of anyone. No bodies. Just silence. We realized with dawning horror that we weren't the first ones to camp here. Greg knelt down, examining the remnants of a torn journal, its pages soaked and unreadable, but enough to show us what had happened. Whoever these people were, they had camped here just like us, and they had disappeared without a trace. For a long moment, none of us spoke. We all just stood there, staring at the remnants of the past, trying to make sense of it. And then we heard it. Footsteps. They were behind us, crunching through the mud, slow and deliberate, growing closer with each passing second. We turned as one, our hearts in our throats, searching for the source of the sound. But there was nothing there, just the trees and the rain and the whispers. "Did you hear that?" whispered Sarah, her voice shaking. We all nodded. We had all heard it, but there was nothing to see. Just the storm. We should have left then. We should have run. But something kept us there, rooted to the spot, staring into the trees, waiting for something. And then I saw it. A figure. It was standing just beyond the tree line, barely visible through the sheets of rain. At first I thought it was Alex, that somehow he had found his way back to us. But as I stared, I realized it wasn't him. It was taller, its limbs too long, its body too thin, and the way it moved, slow, deliberate, but unnatural, sent a cold wave of dread through me. It didn't belong there. It didn't belong anywhere. The figure stepped forward just slightly, and I saw its face, or rather the absence of one. It was human-like, but its features were all wrong. No eyes, no mouth, just a blank, pale face, as if someone had erased the person that was supposed to be there. I wanted to scream, to shout for the others, but my voice caught in my throat. All I could do was stand there, frozen in terror, as the figure took another step forward, closer and closer. And then it was gone, just like that. It melted back into the storm, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. I gasped, finally finding my voice, and told the others what I'd seen. But no one else had spotted it. Greg's eyes narrowed as he listened, his grip tightening on the journal. "It's him," he whispered, more to himself than to us. "The Watcher in the Rain. He's real." We didn't wait to find out what that meant. We turned back toward the camp, moving as fast as we could through the thick mud, the whispers now louder than ever, surrounding us on all sides. They were closer now, more distinct, as if whoever or whatever was whispering to us was right there, just beyond the edge of our vision. But the worst was yet to come. As we neared the campsite, we realized something was wrong. Our tents, what was left of them, had been shredded, torn apart like they had been attacked by some wild animal. The fire was out, smothered by the rain, and the ground was littered with deep, jagged footprints, far larger than the ones we had seen before. And there, in the middle of the wreckage, was Greg's backpack, the journal sticking out from the top. But Greg wasn't with us anymore. He had been right behind us, but now he was gone. Greg had vanished. We called for him, searched the surrounding trees, but there was no trace of him. No footprints, no sound, just the endless rain and the feeling that we were being watched. That night, huddled together in what was left of our camp, we knew we had crossed a line. Whatever was in this forest, it wasn't going to let us leave, and it was only just beginning. The night fell with an oppressive weight, the shadows stretching longer and darker as the rain continued to pour. The world around us blurred, each raindrop amplifying our fear and disorientation. We clung to each other, desperate for comfort, but the reality of our situation settled in like a cold stone in my gut. Then we heard it, a voice. It was faint at first, barely cutting through the sound of the rain, but unmistakable. Alex's voice. It echoed from the depths of the forest, calling out for help. "Help, homie, please." But something about it was wrong. The way it broke and twisted around the raindrops sent shivers down my spine. It didn't sound like him. There was a gravelly undertone, as if it were layered with something sinister. Sarah's eyes darted around, her fear turning into a mix of hope and dread. "It's Alex. He's still out there? We have to go to him." I wanted to argue, to tell her that we should stay put, that venturing into the dark woods would only lead us deeper into danger. But the desperation in her voice was compelling. The thought of abandoning Alex, even to an illusion, gnawed at me. We stood there, our hearts racing, the whispers intensifying as if the forest itself were urging us to make a choice. "We have to go." Greg's voice broke through the chaos. He was shaken, but his determination surged through the fear. "If we stay here, we'll be sitting ducks. We need to find him. Together." With a heavy heart, I nodded. We gathered what little courage we had left and stepped into the darkness, the rain hammering against our backs. The voice grew louder, clearer, pulling us deeper into the woods. "This way. I'm over here," it called, distorted yet familiar. As we followed the sound, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being lured. The rain poured harder, turning the forest floor into a slippery quagmire. Each step was treacherous, and the echoes of our shouts blended with the murmurs of the trees, creating a cacophony that drowned out our own thoughts. Then, without warning, the voice changed. "Help me, you have to come closer." It was no longer just Alex's voice. It twisted into something more, a blend of various sounds and tones, all masked by the steady drumming of the rain. My heart raced as panic coursed through me. This wasn't Alex. This was something else, something pretending to be him. We need to turn back. I shouted over the roar of the storm, but it was too late. The deeper we went, the more disorienting the sounds became. I felt the presence of something following us, weaving through the trees, just beyond the reach of the flickering light from our dying flashlight. Suddenly, the ground shook beneath us. A low growl reverberated through the air, rattling our bones. I turned to the others, but their faces were frozen in horror, eyes wide and fixed on something behind me. I turned slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. It stood there, the entity, tall and twisted, cloaked in shadows and rain. Its form shifted and flickered as if it were made of smoke, every inch radiating a sense of wrongness. The features were an unnatural distortion of human traits, half-formed eyes peering from the dark, a mouth that stretched too wide, filled with jagged teeth. I stumbled backward, my mind racing to comprehend what I was seeing. It was the very embodiment of our fears, the darkness we had tried to escape. The creature's voice echoed, mimicking Alex's words but tainted with malice. "Help me, come closer." Panic surged through us. I felt Sarah grab my arm, her grip vice-like, pulling me away from the creature. "We need to run." But the entity laughed, a deep, guttural sound that echoed through the trees. It seemed to shift, blending into the shadows, then re-emerging closer than before. The realization hit me like a lightning strike. The forest itself was alive, feeding off our fear and confusion. It thrived in the chaos of the storm, drawing power from our dread. In a moment of sheer instinct, I yelled, "Stay together. We can't let it separate us." As if to mock me, the creature lunged forward, its long fingers reaching out toward us. We scattered, adrenaline coursing through our veins as we sprinted in different directions, the thunder crashing overhead. I stumbled through the underbrush, the rain blinding me. I could hear the others shouting, the sounds of struggle, the entity's laughter ringing in my ears. I couldn't let it take anyone else. I found a small hollow near a tree and ducked inside, my heart pounding. I pressed my back against the cold, wet ground and held my breath, praying the creature wouldn't find me. But then I heard it again, the whispers. They crept into my mind, laced with darkness, taunting me. "Join us. You can't escape." Suddenly, I heard footsteps approaching. I held my breath, trying to remain silent. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, almost playful. Then it stopped. "You can't hide from me," it called, its voice echoing in the empty space. "I know where you are." In a surge of desperation, I burst out of the hollow, ready to face whatever horror awaited me. But as I stepped back into the rain, I was met with silence. There was no sign of the others. "Sarah! Greg!" I screamed, my voice lost in the wind. But there was no reply. The forest was empty, save for the sound of the rain. I could feel it in the air. The entity was watching. I stumbled back to the camp, my heart racing as I fought against a growing sense of despair. And then I saw them. Sarah and Greg were standing together at the edge of the clearing, their faces blank, staring into the darkness. I rushed toward them, but as I neared, I realized they were not themselves. They were entranced, caught in some unseen grip. "What's happening?" I shouted, but they didn't respond. They were lost in the whispers, their eyes glazed. I turned back, ready to confront the creature once and for all. The rain continued to pour, but the air grew still, heavy with an ominous charge. "You think you can escape?" the entity hissed, its form materializing before me, blocking my path. "You're part of the forest now. You cannot leave." With a primal scream, I lunged at it, but it simply faded into the shadows, its laughter echoing in the rain. The world around me seemed to shift, reality bending under the weight of fear. In that moment, I understood the forest wasn't just a backdrop for our fears. It was a living thing, thriving on our terror, our doubt. It fed on our panic, on our very souls. With no other choice, I turned and ran, calling for Sarah and Greg. I needed to pull them back from the edge before it was too late. I would fight against the darkness, against the forest that had claimed so many before me. I would not let it take me too, because if I did, I would become part of the horror. What happened to Sarah and Greg? Can I break free from the forest's grip? And what is the truth behind the entity that stalks us in the dark? If you've ever experienced something unexplainable in the wilderness, I want to hear your story. Was it a rustle in the bushes, a voice calling out in the night, or perhaps a figure that disappeared just as you turned your head? Share your encounters in the comments below. Your experiences are not just stories. They're part of something larger, a shared understanding of the unknown that lies beyond our sight. And while you're here, don't forget to subscribe. After the confrontation, I found myself alone in the woods. The storm had taken everything from me, my friends, my sanity, and my sense of reality. I stumbled back to the camp, my heart pounding in my chest. The tent was still standing, but the air around it felt thick and heavy, laden with an unshakable dread. I couldn't bear to think about what might have happened to Sarah and Greg. The forest felt alive, every rustle and creak echoing with the weight of their absence. The rain had subsided, but the darkness remained. I followed the path back, praying that the way out was still clear. Then something unimaginable happened. Running towards me was Alex, Sarah, and Greg. Surprised, I rushed towards them, hugging, examining, and checking them. "They're the ones." How they escaped, I didn't know. They didn't know too. From behind me came the shadows pointing towards our direction while approaching us. We ran. We ran until our lungs burned and our hearts felt like they would burst. The shadows chased us, twisting through the trees, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Every breath was a battle against the fear that clung to us like the rain soaking our clothes. Finally, we broke through the dense foliage, emerging onto a familiar path that led to our cars. I turned to see if Alex, Sarah, and Greg were behind me, their faces pale and eyes wide with terror. We were alive. We had escaped the forest. But as we drove away, the weight of what we had experienced hung over us like a dark cloud. The rain pounded relentlessly on the roof of the car, each drop a reminder of the horrors we had left behind. We promised each other we'd forget, that we would try to move on. But as days turned into weeks, something began to change. At night, in the safety of our homes, the whispers returned. Soft at first, barely audible over the sound of the rain tapping against the window. Come back to us." They lured me from sleep, twisting through my dreams. I would wake, drenched in sweat, heart racing, convinced that the darkness was creeping closer. And then came the nightmares. Visions of the forest flooded my mind. Trees twisting into grotesque shapes, shadows dancing just beyond the edge of my vision. I could feel the presence of something watching, waiting. Sarah, Alex, and Greg experienced it too. We gathered, desperate for answers, sharing our experiences late into the night. It was then we discovered we were not alone in our fear. The whispers haunted us all. One evening, as a storm rolled in, I found myself alone in my bedroom. The wind howled outside, and the rain crashed against the window, filling the room with an eerie rhythm. I tried to drown out the fear with music, but it did little to silence the whispers that curled around my mind. Just as I began to drift off, I heard it, a voice, soft yet insistent, slicing through the veil of sleep. It was familiar yet chilling. "Come, join us." I jolted awake, the darkness of my room wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I strained to listen, every hair on my body standing on end. The sound of rain continued, but now I could hear it, a faint whisper calling my name. "Jake! Jake!" I sat up, heart pounding, the realization hitting me like a punch. It was that voice, the voice from the forest. Fear clawed at my throat as I glanced around the room. The shadows danced menacingly along the walls, and I could feel the air grow thick with an unseen presence. The whispering continued, insistent and growing louder. "Come back." My heart raced as I remembered what we had experienced. The realization that whatever we had encountered was not finished with us yet. I stood up, eyes wide, searching for the source of the voice, the darkness enveloping me. Just then, the wind picked up outside, and the rain slammed harder against the window. I rushed to the window, peering through the rain-smeared glass, but there was nothing, just the heavy shadows of the night. I turned back, ready to grab my phone and call Sarah, but then a sudden chill swept through the room, and I felt a presence behind me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. "Jake!" The whisper was right next to me, so close I could feel its icy breath. I spun around, but no one was there. I stumbled back, heart racing, knowing I was not alone. The thing we had feared in the forest had followed me home. It had seeped into my life, infiltrating my thoughts, my dreams, my very reality. I backed away, my mind racing, searching for an escape, but the darkness loomed closer, wrapping around me like a living thing. Would you ever camp in a forest during a storm after hearing this story? And as the rain continued to beat against the window, I realized the nightmare wasn't over.